Welcome to the Podcast Digest, the podcast dedicated to helping you find the best shows worthy of your subscription, as well as conversations with their creators. And now, your host, Dan Lizette.
Hello, folks. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is episode 76, and my name's Dan Lizette. Thank you guys for joining me again. I've got another great interview for you and a host of different podcasts that I'm sure you'll be wanting to add to your subscription list. I'm back in my absolute favorite category of technology podcasters, and I've been extremely fortunate, in my opinion, to be joined by one of my all-time favorites this week. He is one of the co-hosts of Accidental Tech Podcast, of Reconcilable Differences from Relay FM, Robot or Not, and the Incomparable on the Incomparable Network. I actually referred to him several episodes back, as, in my opinion, as one of the preeminent commentators in all things Apple and technology. It's my privilege to welcome Mr. John Siracusa to the Podcast Digest. John, thanks for joining me.
I'm glad to be here.
It's awesome to talk to you. I couldn't even tell you how many years at this point I've been listening to you through all the way back to the hypercritical days with Dan on 5x5. I think I probably picked up on that show very early on, and it's been a blast following you and many things I want to ask. But for anybody who's not familiar with you, maybe not familiar with your background before some of your podcasts, can you tell folks a little bit about your personal background, where you're from, and your love of technology, how that all started?
I was just going to say that it's refreshing that you kind of have listened to me on podcasts for a long time and know about all my backstory, and then I wouldn't have to explain it. But now, here you go. You've asked me to explain it. It is actually kind of difficult to explain. My background is fairly simple. I've always been a nerd. I was very into technology. I was a Mac user from the very first Macintosh. And when I went off to become an adult, I went off to school. I got my education in computers. I work in computers. I'm a programmer, web developer. And podcasting, boy, how did I go from that into podcasts? I'm not entirely sure. I think I got there by way of technical writing. So, in the dawning of the internet, I was writing reviews of my favorite things on the internet and discussing things in forums. And I ended up being a writer for Ars Technica, the technology website. And I did reviews of what was then the new Macintosh operating system called Mac OS X that we all know and love today, although they took the Mac part off. And for years, I wrote very long reviews about that OS. And somewhere in there, I got roped into podcasting kind of simultaneously on The Incomparable, which is a podcast about nerdy things like television shows, books, and movies, and video games, not so much about technology. And then I also started my own podcast with Dan Benjamin on 5x5 called Hypercritical, which I guess was a technology podcast. I don't know. You can tell me. And it just kind of snowballed from there. Like I always kind of knew that podcasts were interesting to me and it's something I might be into. I just didn't know how to begin. And as with so many things, even with the writing in Ars Technica, it took someone else to sort of kick me in the butt and say, hey, why don't you do this thing? And for me to go, oh, all right. Okay, I'll do it. I mean, it happened with Ars Technica writing. It happened with podcasting. Who knows what it'll happen with next.
And I imagine anyone who is not familiar with you in podcasting is probably familiar with the infamous OS X reviews for Ars Technica. You have since stepped back from that enterprise, but that was a huge undertaking for any number of years that you did that for. And I know you've talked about it a lot on ATP in terms of what the experience is like. I guess my one question is do you miss it at all now?
Sometimes I miss writing, not so much the process of like sort of having the artifact, because having writing on the web that a lot of people have read and that you can link to and that people refer to is gratifying in many ways. And podcasting, I have a limited amount of time because none of these things are my full-time jobs. Like I said, my full-time job as a programmer has always been. And having a full-time job and a family doesn't leave that much extra time left over. And so now that I do so much podcasting, it really doesn't leave much room for writing. Not so much like as wall clock time, but just like all this activity takes something out of you. A full-time job takes a lot out of you. A family takes a lot out of you, and you have a little bit of leisure time, and you have a little bit of time for this type of stuff, which is like in between leisure. It's like fun stuff that you do that's kind of work, but also kind of fun. And once I've talked for a few hours a week on a podcast, like the rest of the time, I just want to, sleep or watch television or just hang out with my family. So it doesn't leave a lot of time for writing. So in that respect, like I said, I miss the idea that my words are out there in text form. It feels more permanent than audio form. But on the other hand, I really do enjoy podcasting, and I feel like I can get a lot more of myself out with podcasting than I can with writing. So I'd say it's a net win, but it is something that, like, if I had my druthers, I would get back to it somehow. But like, I can't put more hours into the day, so I'm not sure how that would work.
But you don't think it would necessarily be with a review, maybe more blog style, commentary style entries?
Yeah, I mean, I had that at Ars Technica. Like, for a while, they had this thing they called staff journals, which was giving basically people on the Ars Technica staff an opportunity to write in their own voice about whatever the heck they wanted. And I had a staff journal called Fat Bits that's still online. You could find it. And for a while there, for a few years, I was not blogging as much as like a full-time blogger would blog, but way more often than I ever did in any other period. I would, every week or two I would write something, and there's a big long history of blogs there. A lot of them, like any blog, they're very dated and kind of transient and just my thoughts at the time. But that was a different style of writing that I also enjoyed. It's not like, oh, here's a big review of a product. It's just, here's what's on my mind. Obviously focused on technology, usually focused on Apple. So, because it was on Ars Technica, so it had some constraints. It just wasn't me musing about whatever popped into my head. But, and then, I have the hypercritical.co website where I have similar type of blogging, mostly about technology, but some other random stuff in there as well. And for a little while, I tried to get that going, but it was, again, difficult to find the time. And in the end, podcasting just won.
Yeah, and that was one thing I was going to mention was your co-hosts on ATP, both Casey and Marco, and maybe a little bit more so Marco than Casey, have made their blogs and their writing component of sort of their messaging kind of a focus for them. I've heard them both talk about that. But that hasn't been anything for you. Is that just sort of a time component like you were describing? Like there's only so many hours in a day or week.
Yeah, you have to decide how to divide up your time. Casey's got a full-time job as well and a new family as well. So I don't know how he's deciding to divide up his time. But writing is difficult for me. Like, in terms of, I can't just rattle something off. It happens every once in a while. It's kind of like how I've heard a lot of artists refer to songwriting, where a lot of the songwriters I admire describe the process as very difficult. Like, it doesn't come easily to them, and it's every song is a fight, and a lot of them are failures, and it really takes a lot of mental energy and time to get something. And then every once in a while, a song just drops out of them like effortlessly. Like once in a blue moon, like one of their 2 or 3 hits is like that one just plopped out of me in 5 minutes when I was in front of the piano, and the whole song was there, lyrics, music, and everything. It was a great hit, and but that's the exception. The rule is it's a battle. So I've had writing experiences like that too, where every once in a while, some post, I just get an idea for it. Usually, after everyone else in my family's asleep, I'll sit down and write for an hour, and then boom, it's done. But most of the time, that's not what it's like, especially the style of writing that became sort of my signature, which is filled with links and facts and background that you could follow to find out much more about the topic, and filled with a lot of things that need to be fact-checked, basically. Like, I have a notion about something, but is that really true? Well, do I have to write a program to test it? How do I find out the answer to this? Do I have to contact somebody who knows more than I do about it and ask? Like, it becomes, I'm not going to call it journalism, but it becomes technical writing, where you really have to look everything up and fact check everything and test your assumptions and really truly understand something before you can write anything about it. In some of my OS 10 reviews, I'd write like 2 paragraphs over the course of like a week. Like a week for those 2 paragraphs. So granted, those 2 paragraphs would have a lot of facts and a lot of links in them, but I don't even know where the rest of it's going until I can figure out, until I learn the information that I'm trying to convey. It's not as if I'm born knowing this information. I have to learn it. Then I have to convey it accurately to the audience, and that takes a long time.
In your style, so to speak, John, I've always thought that there is sort of the next generation Siracusa, if you will, and I think he's out there already and doing the work. And I haven't heard you really talk too much about what he's put out there, but these sort of massive entrees and factual and links and those type of things seem to be something that Renee Ritchie's really kind of taken the mantle up of. What do you think about the work that Renee's doing?
I've heard this idea a lot of the people, me that stop doing my reviews, and people want to know who is the anointed person who does similar work. And I've heard a lot of people suggest it. I've heard Renee, I've heard Vitici, whenever anyone writes anything large and complicated and kind of in that style. But I really feel like that's a disservice to the people writing these reviews. They're their own people. They have their own style, which may or may not be influenced by my style at all.
Right.
And even my reviews, I may have sort of been one of the early practitioners of the of this particular form, which would only survive on the internet. It's like it's for an audience of people who already know a ton about a topic, and they are hungry for more. They want to become more informed because they're into the hobby, because they're like, I know a little bit about this, but if I knew even more, it would make me feel better. Whereas most people have a surface level understanding that's fine for them. Other people just want to know everything they possibly can. They want to understand more. They're going to tolerate big, long sections that give them some foundational information. And it has to be presented in a way that's not like a textbook, because if they really want to know more, why don't they just go to college or read college textbooks and learn the fundamentals and do the same stuff that, you know what I mean? They don't want to do that. They want to be entertained. They want to be brought along on a journey, but they want to become more knowledgeable at the end of it. And so that is not my invention. That audience always existed. And sites like Ars Technica and Tom's Hardware and Real World Tech and Anon Tech and all these other sites were serving that audience. It's saying there are a bunch of people out there who are interested in technology and who crave deeper understanding of it. They want to know about all the latest stuff. They want to understand it at a fundamental level so they can judge future things that are coming out and so on and so forth. And different sites have different audiences, but to some degree, there are people like that. People who in the old days would be reading those sites who are now, writing for either their own sites or somebody else's, and writing very long form, detailed things for an audience that wants to learn more. I think the audience of iMore and Mac Stories and everything is different than the Ars Technica audience, but both Renee and Viticci are very. They have a lot that they want to say, and they may concentrate on different things than I did, but they are both writing to an audience that wants to eat that stuff up. So I think everyone, that just because I stop writing doesn't mean that form goes away. That audience is always out there. It's just being served by different sites and different needs. And for example, another place people get this information is from podcasts and YouTube channels, which were far less popular back when I was writing. So there's always a new way for these type of people to get their information.
Well, I think most would agree, though, no matter who else is sort of taking up the mantle, if there is one or not, nobody included the Easter eggs that you did, John.
Hey, people have their own Easter eggs. Like, I didn't make up the idea of Easter eggs either. Like, I mean, here's what it is. It's in some ways, it's like where you have a movie reviewer or something that you really come to sort of know. You may not agree with their opinions, but eventually you come to know that if my favorite movie reviewer says this about this kind of movie, I know I either will or won't like it. Not many people know many famous movie reviewers. Everyone thinks of Siskel and Ebert, but there are plenty of other ones where you just feel like you get to know the person, and that helps you pin down whatever it is they're trying to say in their review. And every person is different, so people feel like they get to know Renee and read his review, and it's a combination of them knowing him through all of his tremendous amount of writing and his personality and his podcasts and his videos, and seeing year after year him review things, or Jason Snell even. Like, you start to get to know the author, and that's like a personal relationship between the audience and the person. And then anything they review, you have an extra angle on, because you're like, not only is this person providing information, but I have an extra dimension because I know the person and I know what they said about the last 3 versions of this, so I have a better insight into the actual product.
Yeah, it's I'm sure you've heard from many that it's been missed, and I know that I had Instapapered and many of those reviews over the years, and but that said, as you mentioned, a lot of other vehicles are there now for this to get out, and some of your podcasts are definitely ways of doing that. I want to go back on the podcasting just a little bit to the start of Hypercritical and Incomparable as you started to appear there. Did you feel like this was something that clicked with you immediately? Did the bug kind of get you as this is something I want to do more of, or was this kind of an oddity for you as you first started?
I wish I could remember how I listened to my first podcasts. I know what they were, and I'm like, how did this happen to me? The first podcast I listened to was, I believe it was, this changed title a few times. Anyway, it was I Should Be Writing by Mur Lafferty. And I think there was another title, or anyway, some set of Mur Lafferty podcasts way back in the day that I listened to for a long time. I still listen to occasionally. And she was, the motto of that show was, for wannabe fiction writers by a wannabe fiction writer, because she was an aspiring author. She wanted to write fiction. She hadn't yet to be published, so she was a wannabe fiction writer. And this was a podcast for other wannabe fiction writers where she would share her struggles and advice and information and stories about the difficulty of being a fiction writer, how, working on your craft of writing, dealing with the business aspect, how to do submissions, how to deal with editing, how to deal with criticism, how to try to find an agent and a publisher and all that other stuff. And it was just her in her house talking into a microphone about a topic that really, I'm not a wannabe fiction writer. Even though I was a writer, I could relate to it at some level. I was, being a fiction writer was not my passion. So it's not like I was particularly interested in the subject matter, but for whatever reason, I was fascinated by the form. Hearing someone just, technologically, it didn't seem that complicated. It seemed like something anybody could do. And it seemed very personal, even in a way that blogs didn't. And it helps that she had a very sort of deliberate style of speaking, and her voice was very soothing, and she was funny, and she was nerdy, and I'm a nerd, and it was like, I don't know, I found it oddly compelling, and I listened to a huge number of those, and I got it into my head that, this seems like something I can do, because I can talk into a microphone, and I have a lot of things to say sometimes, and sometimes I feel like no one wants to hear the things I have to say, but if you just talk into a microphone and put it out on the internet, then the people who want to hear what you have to say can hear it, and the people who don't won't have to. So it seemed, I definitely had it in my mind well before I did any podcasting of my own that podcasting was really cool and it's a thing that I was interested in doing that I thought I maybe could do. So when the opportunity presented itself, I think the first time I got the inkling of it is when we were having Twitter conversations with Jason Snell and several other people who would come to be on the Incomparable, including myself, talking about nerdy stuff. And the idea came up, we should have a podcast about this. And Jason actually got off his butt and did it. And so, the Incomparable is an ensemble show, so it's a rotating cast of people, and I am one of those people. I remember he did the first 2 or 3 episodes of the Incomparable without me, and I was like, hey, I'm over here. Remember I wanted to do this thing? There was a long wait. The first episode of the Incomparable I was on was, I believe, episode 3. So, but I was nervous there for a second, and I think that was my first podcast around the same time. Dan Benjamin was starting at 5x5 and looking for podcasts to do, and he knew me from my writing on Ars Technica and everything. I said, hey, you want to do a podcast? And, I said, sure, let's do it. I didn't know when I would find time. I didn't know if I'd be any good at it. I didn't know if I had that much to say. But I sort of dove into both of those at, more or less the same time. I think the Incomparable came first by a little bit, but with the recording schedules and how long, the setup and everything took, I'm not quite sure what the timeline was. But anyway, I definitely wanted to do it, and I dove right in and haven't looked back.
So looking back at Hypercritical, I think that was the first time I ever heard you on a show. It ran for exactly 100 episodes, and I consider it a tech podcast. I know you obviously went outside those walls, as you commonly do on The Incomparable, and you guys occasionally do on ATP, and, well, Real Bad or Not's a completely different animal. I don't know if that's a tech show or what you would call that. But looking back at Hypercritical for that run, I know, at least from my perspective, John, and tell me if your perspective is different, that seemed like a big deal in terms of a big hit, if you will. To me, it seemed like one of 5x5's biggest early shows and seemed to really kind of create a lot of conversations. A lot of things sprung from that. Is that a fair summary?
Well, it's weird being involved in the show. In the beginning, I was mostly concerned with, was I going to be able to figure out how to do this podcasting thing. So a lot of it was inward looking, and also the Hypercritical show, the show format, the topic, everything about it was my conception. Dan just basically said, do you want to do a podcast? You can do it about whatever you want. So he gave me a blank slate, basically. So I knew it was going to be about, tech and Apple stuff or whatever, like the little explanation that's on the beginning of every episode, and it's on the website, a weekly talk show ruminating on exactly what is wrong in the world of Apple and related technologies and businesses, right? Nothing is so perfect that it can't be complained about. That was all my little snippet. There was a sort of a humorous summary of a thing I'd written on the Ars Technica blog, the FatBits blog, titled Hypercritical, that far preceded the podcast. This idea that, this particular personality trait of always criticizing things and looking for flaws and being introspective and all that other stuff, and how that could be a positive thing and not just a negative thing. So Hypercritical was a very personal show because it was my first outing in podcasting. It was based on my personality and a particular idea that I had about myself and the world. And at the same time, I'm trying to figure out if I can do a podcast. So Hypercritical felt like just taking me, like everything that I had pent up that I wanted to tell the world verbally, and just dumping it out. And that's why I felt like it was a 100 episode, like limited run. It was like, this is what's inside of me. Shake the big can, dump, 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 dump. And in the beginning, all I could see was, here I am dubbing myself out. Here's the mechanics of podcasting. How am I doing? Like, the show format just sort of fell out of what I felt was natural. The whole idea of follow-up and the structure of the show and the topics and everything about it. And around about halfway through the show, I started to realize that other people were listening to the show. Like, in the beginning, I don't know. I mean, like 5x5 was just starting. I had nothing to compare it to. Like, with writing, I had been doing writing for a while on the web, and I had, I don't know if I was paying more attention to the metrics or whatever, but I had no idea if anyone was listening to Hypercritical. But as I started to get more feedback, and people would talk to me about it, and I realized that I was becoming known for Hypercritical, even perhaps more so than all this writing I've been doing then for years on Ars Technica. The idea that when someone heard your voice, they made a more of a connection with you than a byline that they might not have even read on some, like it has your name at the top of the article, but they scroll past that and start reading the article. So do they even know it's you, right? So towards the end of the run, I realized it was a pretty popular show, and I definitely realized by the end of the run the power of people hearing your voice and how that's different from being an author and having your name above a bunch of text that people may or may not read. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, many, 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 many more people read what I wrote at Ars Technica than ever listened to any of my podcasts. But the people who listened to my podcast knew who I was. Like, they could recognize my voice. They felt a closer connection to me as a person because I would talk about personal things and stuff like that. So it was a very different kind of audience, very different kind of relationship with the audience. And it was definitely a new experience for me.
Well, I know I enjoyed the show, and I was probably one of many that was a little, I don't know, sad, disappointed that it had come to an end, but I knew it wouldn't be the end in terms of what we'd be hearing from you, and it wasn't even close, obviously. The Incomparable was still going on, and what's the experience been like that? Because obviously the Incomparable is sort of different than almost anything else that's out there. Tell folks a little bit more about that show. I know it's the nerdy topics, and what's that experience like being a part of that rotating cast of characters, if you will?
The Incomparable was always much less pressure because, first of all, it wasn't my show. It's Jason's show. I mean, we all kind of had the idea for it together, but he made it happen. Like, the idea is vague. Hey, we should have a bunch of people talk about nerdy things that we enjoy talking about. Fine. But he made the show. He dictated the format, the name, the cast of characters, the topics, the whole thing. And having a rotating cast means that I'm not on that show every week. In fact, I don't ever have to be on the Incomparable unless the topic of the week is something that I'm interested in. Now, sometimes I can instigate that topic by saying, hey, we should talk about whatever, and I want to be on that or whatever. And sometimes it's obvious what the topic will be, like if a new Star Wars movie is coming out or something. But it's more like a forum for discussing things. And there's a whole bunch of group of people who, it started out as a bunch of people that Jason knew. Like, how did the seed of the cast of the Incomparable happen? It's people that Jason knew, right? And it has expanded out from that to try to become, more than just a bunch of Jason's friends talking about things. But the topic rotates according to a schedule that Jason sets of, like, are we talking about books this week, movies, comic books, old things, new things, and there have been new formats that have come in and out, and it has spawned eventually an entire network of podcasts, the Incomparable Network, that are all varied. A lot of the things that are now their own podcasts started out as just topics on the Incomparable, like particular TV shows or the radio theater things that we do and all that stuff. And again, I don't have to be on any of those, so it's sort of like I get to hop in whenever the topic interests me. And that's ideal because then the only people who are on the show are people who have an interest in a particular topic. And because it's basically not technology, because it's about, movies that we've seen recently or a favorite book series or, a television show or some kind, a genre or whatever, that really mixes it up. And it is a refreshing break from talking about technology because really no one's ever talking about Apple or Microsoft or any kind of technological stuff in that show. It's all just about, and usually things that I like. Like, I like to be on the episodes of the Incomparable things that I like. All the other shows are obviously hypercritical, but then an Accidental Tech Podcast and Reconcilable Differences, it's like introspective and criticism and investigation and examination and analysis. And on the Incomparable, my favorite ones are where I get to talk about something that I really, really love. So all I'm doing is gushing the whole time. And that's sort of my yin and yang of podcasting for the past many years.
And ATP, you mentioned ATP. I don't know. You may look at it a little bit differently, but in terms of this one listener, is one of the preeminent tech podcasts that is out there. As far as I'm concerned, it is one of the most must listens in my very long subscription list, and I know there are a lot of people out there who do enjoy the work that you guys are doing. But this kind of is interesting because ATP is accidental tech podcast, and it literally started by accident. This was supposed to be a car podcast, right?
Yeah, you mentioned after Hypercritical, you thought, well, surely you hear more of me on podcasts. And when Hypercritical ended, I wasn't that sure because, like I said, Hypercritical was like a personal dump of like, here's everything that's been pent up inside of me that hasn't been written in a blog post that I might want to say about like this entire sector. And there's a finite amount of that because once you dump it all out, it's not like I have these new revelations or insights every single week. Like Hypercritical was very structured. For every show, I had an outline. I had a bunch of stuff I wanted to say. And there was a structure to it, and there was usually some kind of argument to be made, like much more structured than you would imagine a weekly podcast to be. And this is a finite amount of that stuff. So once I was done, when I really felt like I was done with that, I'm like, well, all right, that was that, but there's not any more of that in me. So certainly I'm not up for like another weekly podcast. And, I needed a break at that point because it was very time consuming to prepare every one of those episodes. And it was happening every single week, in addition with all my other stuff. So I just couldn't sustain that. And so obviously after that, the podcast was popular enough, people wanted me to do other podcasts, and I mostly just turned all of them down. Marco offered to do a car podcast because I knew him and he knew I was interested in cars, and we talk about cars and stuff like that. And I was like, well, can we really talk about cars? Like, yeah, we all like cars, but do we really know that much about it? Like, we're not gearheads or anything. Like, really, not like we're tech heads. Why should we do a car podcast? So it'll be a casual car podcast. We'll talk about cars, from the perspective of people who are not super into it, but just kind of into cars and have opinions about things. That's why it was called Neutral, because it is the most sort of, it's like the opposite of like Top Gear or something, or like some other name like Full Throttle, or some other name that expresses how incredibly deeply into cars this podcast is. Neutral is the most boring gear. We like cars. We're going to talk about them. We got opinions, but So anyway, Neutral was the perfect name for that show. It was me, Marco, and someone who at that point I think I had never met or spoken to before. No, that's not true. Sorry, Casey. It was Marco's friend Casey, who I met at WWDC. But otherwise, I knew Casey through Marco. And, whatever we're going to do. And he's into cars. I'm into cars. We'll do this car show. We'll talk about cars. I think Neutral had a couple of problems. One is we're not that into cars. Like, we like them and we have opinions, but how much do we really have to say about it week after week? It was fun. It was fun to talk to Marco and Casey about cars. We had fun doing it, but not that many people were listening because, like, if anybody knew, me or Marco, they wanted to hear us talk about tech stuff. And at the end of each episode of Neutral, when we were recording, after the Neutral episode was over, we would just continue talking for a little bit, as we tend to do. We would end up talking about tech stuff, all three of us, because, Casey's a programmer and a new Mac user, and me and Marco had our own tech-related podcast. And so after episodes of Neutral, we would have 5, 10, 15, 20-minute conversations about whatever the heck Apple was doing. And we would all still be recording them. And I think if you go back and listen to, like, episode 1 of ATP, we're like, why is this first episode, like, 15 minutes long or however long? Maybe it's probably 30 minutes, but whatever it is. Why is it so short? Well, why is it not like the other episodes? Because it literally was accidental. Like, we weren't trying to do a tech podcast. We were trying to do a car podcast, and we would just keep recording when it was over, and we would end up talking about tech. And Marco basically said, you know what? If we just took, like, people want to hear us talk about tech. People don't want to hear us talk about cars. Why don't we just take this thing where the three of us are talking about tech and release it as a podcast? And so, what will be called? Accidental Tech Podcast. And so that's how ATP came to be. Neutral ended, and we had like a bonus episode there. Neutral ended after, only a handful of episodes. It was fun. I enjoyed doing it, but not a lot of people listened to it. And ATP proved to be much more popular. And now we do the opposite. On ATP, when the show is kind of over, if we have car stuff to talk about, we just keep talking. We end up talking about car stuff. So it all works out.
Yeah, I was going to mention the same thing. I think Neutral never really ended because it lives on. It's its own segment, I think, on ATP, and I think Marco denotes it with the sound effects too.
Yeah, it's not every week, every once in a while, because we still have cars and talk about cars. So when you hear the car door closing sound effect, that means we're beginning a Neutral segment. That's always like the tail end of the show after the song. We have a weird form. ATP is a strange show. ATP has evolved. Its origins match its continued life, where it's not particularly planned, and the format, as strange as it is, has evolved over time. So there is a substantial amount of lore and sort of historical understanding that goes into listening to an ATP episode and understanding why the hell it is the way it is. Even if you don't know, you can listen and it's fine. You just accept it the way it is. But it all actually does make sense from a historical perspective.
Well, and of course, the entertainment that comes from the internal bickering about that format is part of the entertainment as well, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's what you get when you have too many cooks. So, we all have opinions about the way the thing. We all have our own podcasts. We all had our own podcasts, and we have our own separate podcasts that are just us and sort of a more secondary host. But an ATP, it's it's the three of us more or less as equals. Battling for control, I guess.
So you mentioned when Hypercritical started, it took sort of halfway through the run before you realized that anybody was listening to this. But with ATP, I imagine there was a thought in the back of your mind that as it kind of transitioned from Neutral to a tech format, especially featuring you and Marco, that this could be sort of a bigger deal. Now that you guys are 130 episodes in or something like that, wherever you stand at this point, are you surprised now looking back from where it started to where you guys are now? Was this what you sort of would have predicted, or did it still kind of exceed expectations?
It actually had a pretty slow growth. If you go look at the historical, we have our own numbers, and we can see graph it from the beginning of the thing. It was a slow, steady climb. It wasn't as if we released the podcast and overnight it was just a smash success. It might seem like that, but it really did take a pretty linear ramp up. I had faith that there was an audience for this, because at that point, Marco had done Build and Analyze, and he had stopped that, and I had done Hypercritical, and I had stopped that. We both knew we had reasonable audiences, so we're like, well, if we got we're not sure what the overlap of those things. Say the overlap was even 100%. If we can get some percentage of the people who listen to our old podcast, listen to the new one, that's still perfectly viable as a podcast audience. And I felt like we could get more. I've always felt like, even today, I feel like we can get more in terms of how many people are there in the world who, if presented with their podcast, would find it entertaining and informative and would enjoy it. That number is way more than the number of people that actually listen. Not that we do anything particular with marketing, but with podcasts, there are so many people who just don't listen to podcasts, period. The podcasting is not on their radar as even a thing. It's still a little bit fidgety and a little bit weird, and for a lot of people, it's not something that fits into their life at all. It has no slot. Maybe they don't even know the word, right? Tons of people, I think, would enjoy our podcast who aren't listening to it, right? So I know there's an audience, and I know it because based on all those years of writing for Ars Technica, so many of those people who read those giant articles, almost all of them would enjoy my podcast, or really any of the similar tech podcasts, right? But they're just not podcast listeners. So I feel like the growth of podcasting will raise the audience for ATP. But in terms of its performance as a show, I've been very happy with it. It has done as well as I would expect. Again, I don't know what the growth curve of Hypercritical was, but I figure it was similarly slow. But I think basically we have done a good job at bringing over a lot of the audience that enjoyed our past podcast and bringing in some new people as well. I just think there's a lot more room for the medium to grow and for our show to grow.
I've been wanting to ask you, which was one of the questions I was super excited to get to talk to you about since you agreed to join me, was on ATP on several occasions, especially over the last year or so. You guys have gone off sort of the straight technological topic into more of the related to technological topics. Women in tech, the Gamergate, things of that nature. Those are some of the episodes that have absolutely stuck in my mind. And it's sort of similar to a conversation when Casey was a guest here on the show. Him and I talked about, his episode of Analog with, I believe, both Mike and Steven, where they talked about all kinds of really important personal issues. And I think that I consider those episodes sort of important, that there's almost like important work being done when you release an episode with that type of content and commentary. Internally, talking amongst the three of you guys, was there any trepidation or fear about kind of wading into those areas? Was there any questioning of, do folks expect this to come from us? Or just kind of what was the process like covering some of those topics?
There's definitely a lot of caution about those things, and not because we are, we're afraid that we're going to defy the audience's expectations, but mostly because, and this is the same reason we eventually decided to talk about them, because we don't have all the answers. Like, these are difficult topics that are challenging to us as well as to the audience. So when we do an episode like that, it's not like Hypercritical where everything is all planned out and we have an outline or something. It's not like these things are written ahead of time. We go in there with a topic list and some minor points, and then we work it out on the air. Like, the three of us work it out together. So it's, we don't know if we have the answers. We don't know if we're going to put our feet in our mouth. We don't know what we don't know yet, right? And I think that's part of the role of podcasting, and it's particularly a show like ATP, where people listen because they relate to the human beings on the show. And having us work through these difficult issues on the air hopefully helps other people to work through it themselves and to think about the topic. And I mean, sometimes we're saying things that are new to people, ideas they may not have heard, angles they might not have considered. And sometimes what we're saying is things that people who are listening have thought of 15 years ago, and it's old hat to them, and they think they have a lot to tell us about the topic. It's much scarier than something like technology or programming or something, where we are, if not, absolute experts in every aspect of the field. We have, professional experience, and we're all programmers in that show, and we've all done technical writing before. And so we feel like we have much more grounding there. The vast majority of the audience is going to be, we're going to be imparting information and experience to the majority of the audience. But these other topics that are tech related, we may have experience in the tech world, but if we don't have experience with these other related topics to the tech world, or online harassment, or women in tech, or just all sorts of things, like, we may be adjacent to them. We may have experienced them from the other side, but trying to get, to grasp an issue that we don't have direct experience with is always dangerous. But we always feel like that we want to have an episode or two where we try to work this out on the air, even if we end up kind of making fools of ourselves or are putting a foot wrong or whatever, that we learn from it, and that we hope that people listening learn from it too. Because if we just avoid it entirely, it's like pretending it doesn't exist, and it feels worse to just say, oh, well, this is a tech podcast and we can only talk about tech. I mean, this is tech related. Like you said, everything is touching technology in some way, and to pretend that it's not, that there's no tech angle on this, that we should only talk about hardware and software, it's just not the type of show we want to do. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the way we think about things. It doesn't fit, I think, what people should really be listening for, and are really, like, they're listening for us. They're not listening for a machine spewing out specifications and facts. And I mean, they can just go to a website and read a press release for that. They're listening for three people talking about technology. And if this is something that is affecting us and that we're thinking about, and it's even vaguely tech related, we're going to talk about it.
As one of the larger shows in sort of the technology subcategory in iTunes, I mean, have you guys ever felt discussed or even just internally considered that many fans of technology, and myself am a huge one, there are probably many people in, let's call it the tech community, the nerds, the uber nerds, the fans of Apple or what have you, could be labeled or considered, somewhat insular in maybe their opinions or their view on larger scale topics, be it in or out of technology. Have you guys ever felt sort of this inherent responsibility to maybe drive a narrative or open a dialogue on perspectives or topics that community may not typically consider?
It's kind of like it's kind of a self-selecting thing where, people will seek out the opinions of people that they agree with, and people who are like them and with similar backgrounds. So it's not as if there is one sphere. There are many overlapping spheres centered around, experiences or interests or identities, some combination of those things. And the first step in having any, addressing any of these topics at all is to understanding that everybody has an identity, a set of experiences, and a set of interests that defines a circle of things and people that you are most naturally drawn towards. But realizing that your experiences and your identity and your interests don't necessarily overlap with all these other people. So the easiest one is people have exactly the same interests as you, but have different experiences and identities. And therefore, maybe you don't travel in those circles or talk to those people or see those people, and they don't see you or hear you or talk to you, and yet you're all interested in the same things. And then, the obvious question is, why are we separate? Am I not seeing their perspectives and hearing what they have to say, and why are they not hearing what I have to say? Like that these worlds are separate and they should be together, and they're not for reasons that have nothing to do with interest. That we all love computers and technology, and women is the easiest one of those. Tons of women are interested in exactly the same things, and yet why are all these podcasts a bunch of guys talking about technology, and why do I not hear women's perspectives on things, and so on and so forth? And Gamergate was actually an opportunity for a lot of people to see some of the circles overlapping, where it was a big enough story that people became more aware of the typical experience of women. And we're not a gaming podcast, but gaming is somewhat close to tech. Seeing what's going on over there and realizing, that's just not a gaming concern. That happens everywhere in every possible topic, including technology. And so we're forced to look at ourselves and our community and say, are we really that different? What could we be doing better to make technology more welcoming to women than gaming has been? And and it goes out from there as you ripple out in circles. Who cares about technology and gaming, but into the wider world and everything. And I'm sure we do a lousy job of it. This is not our area of expertise, but we always feel like that we have to make an effort. If you're not making an effort, we shouldn't be on defense. We should be on offense. We should be trying to make things better, trying to learn from the people who have experience in this area, trying to, again, on the episodes, one of the easiest things that you can do is just start following more women who are interested in technology on Twitter. Start reading more of their blogs. Make what was once not visible to you become visible, so you can start getting some insight and perspective. I mean, there's only so much we can do because we're just a bunch of dudes with a podcast, but not making an effort or becoming defensive, it just felt like the wrong things to do. So we make an effort, however feeble, and we continue to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I listen to every episode of ATP, but those have always stood out as some of my personal favorites. So just a little bit of listener feedback for you there. But there's something else that's also been coming out lately that I am a huge fan of, and it's almost like if there was fantasy podcasting, I would think that, a year or two ago, folks would love to have heard John Siracusa and Merlin Mann together on a show. And now it's a thing with Reconcilable Differences. How did this come up? And tell folks about what this is that you guys are doing.
What can you say about Merlin Mann? How can you explain? It's harder to explain him than it is to explain me. I've been, he had a show on 5x5, still does, called Back to Work. He has done many other things. He's had a productivity blog of 43 folders back in the day. He posts things on Tumblr. He tweets. He is a Renaissance man that I've been following for a long time. And he got into podcasting, heavily into podcasting around the same time I did. And even, when I was in Hypercritical and he was doing Back to Work, occasionally we would reference each other because Dan Benjamin was on both podcasts with each of us. So there was some connection there. And we've been on episodes of The Incomparable together, and we, know each other in real life from meeting at WWDC and stuff like that. And I don't know, Merlin basically came to me and said, I would like to do something with you. And I said, I would like to do something with you. And I think many years passed before we actually did anything. But, it's a question of, someone getting off their butt and doing something. Eventually it was Merlin. And so we said, let's try having a podcast together. And I said, what would that podcast be about? And we were both like, I don't know. I guess we'll figure it out as we go. And so the Reconcilable Differences is basically it's just an excuse to get the two of us together because I'm a fan of his work, he's a fan of mine, and we wanted to have a podcast where we talked about things together. And that format is kind of been shaken out a little bit by Merlin with Roderick on the Line, which is his podcast with John Roderick, who is a musician / many other things, who he's known for a long time. Their podcast is a little bit more structured than Reconcilable Differences in that it's Merlin is kind of like the host facilitating John. He's sort of like, Merlin is sort of the Dan Benjamin, and John Roderick is sort of the me, in the hypercritical type format. Reconcilable Differences is more of an even balance in that I'm not quite sure which of us is the sort of host and which is the one who is spilling their guts to the world. I think we alternate kind of back and forth. But anyway, it's definitely not a technology podcast, although we talk about technology sometimes. It's a little bit like Casey Liss's analog podcast about feelings, because we do talk about our feelings sometimes. The nominal structure is trying to figure out how we both got the way we are, because we're both pretty weird. And so we do a lot of time talking about past experiences that led us to be the person that we are. I assume eventually that will run out, and we'll have explored every past experience that led us to be who we are today, and then we'll have to go somewhere from there. But bottom line, it's just an excuse for me and Merlin to talk. And I think the Reconcilable Differences audience initially, and probably now still mostly, is people who listened to me or Merlin on one of our past podcasts and thought, like you just said, boy, it would be interesting to hear these two talk to each other because they're both really big weirdos, but in different ways. I have heard of a few people who have listened to the Reconcilable Differences who'd never heard of either one of us before and listened to it in the same way. Like when I listened to Roderick on the Line initially, I had no idea who John Roderick was, but you hear him and you're like, this guy is an interesting character, and I want to hear more about what he has to say because he makes me laugh and he's weird. So there are people out there who listen to Reconcilable Differences because they, we're weird, and it's interesting to hear what we have to say, and they have no idea who we are, and that's fine too. So that's a very different show. All these shows, ATP, Reconcilable Differences, Incomparable, all very different podcasts, all happen to feature me, but I like to think like each one of them gets a different sort of facet of my personality.
Exactly. And I love it. I Reconcilable Differences, and I've heard Mike and Casey on Analog talk about sort of almost their jealousy of what you guys have created with that show. And I think it's well placed. I have said on, and I don't remember which episode previously I said this about, I've kind of got a Mount Rushmore of kind of technology-based podcasters that obviously do a lot of other things, and you guys hit the 2/3, if you will. My other one that I would throw in if there was ever kind of if Marco or Casey ever got sick, bring Merlin in, and then Andy Anatko. Right. I mean, I think that the three of you have a particular style, an opinion, and an outlook, a way of speaking and storytelling that I think is so appealing. And to hear you and Merlin have come together on this podcast, I think it's getting a lot of attention and a lot of people enjoy it for very good reasons. And it's a wonderful project. And I know there was times at a conversation at a point that it may have been just a summer thing last year, and I was thinking, oh geez, no, this needs to continue, and I'm glad to see that it continues on.
Yeah, it's again a time management thing. Like, as part of the barrier to doing something together was like, how am I going to fit this in? Like, I just really didn't think I could sustain another weekly podcast. So Reconcilable Differences every other week,
right?
And there is a limited amount of time, so I really have to pick and choose. But I really do enjoy doing the podcast with Merlin. That's why we kind of do it in 10-episode chunks to make sure it's sustainable in terms of me not getting burned out and having enough time for my family, and just making sure everything is on balance. And so maybe that's me being terrible and not committing, but ATP, like I feel like I can only sustain one completely open-ended weekly podcast, and ATP is it.
Right.
And then after that, I really have to be careful and pick and choose.
And Merlin's kind of gone off the deep end lately too with podcast. He's all over the place now, it seems, between Reconcilable Differences, Dalrymple Report, obviously Roderick on the Line, and appearances on the Incomparable. He seems to be everywhere all the time too. So
yeah, I mean, he's diversifying. Like I think he's in Roderick on the Line parlance, he's found his duck, at least for now, in terms of like, what do you want to do? What do you find enjoyable? What are you good at? What do people enjoy hearing from you? And he's great at podcasting. And so why shouldn't he do more? And if he's got the time and he can sustain it, then that's, more power to him.
Well, I would be remiss, John, if I didn't, just like I've done previously with Jason and with Casey, previous guests on the Podcast Digest, is if you'll indulge me just a little bit of Apple Talk.
I'm ready.
All right, if that's good by you. So a couple of quick questions about your own usage. And I've heard this mentioned on ATP, and I know you're ribbed mercilessly, and so I don't want to just add to that, but are you still using the iPod Touch in any way anymore? Just curious.
I am not. I'm full iPhone convert. Once I got my iPhone 6, all the iPod Touches went down the line to the kids or to, the attic. No more iPod Touches for me. And obviously once I went to the iPhone 6 and got used to the bigger screen, it's really difficult to go back to that little thing.
Yeah. And so not a plus. You don't like the plus, correct?
Too big.
Too big
for me.
Do you think that you will stay away from it when the 7 arrives, or do you think 4.8 is your max?
I think this is close to my max size. Not so much for the hand, but just in terms of, because I do put it in pockets a lot. It just maybe I go a little bit bigger. But anyway, I'm not up for a new phone. Am I up for a new phone on the 7? Maybe I am. Maybe that's the end of my 2-year cycle. I don't know. I'm not dying to get a new phone. My 6 is fine. I can use. I have no problem using hardware for a really long time, especially if I like it. But I really don't ever see myself moving up to the next really big size.
What about iPads? I don't think you do not have a Pro, correct?
Do not.
No appeal there at all. Generally speaking, is it not something up your alley?
I would love to have a Pro, but it is big and expensive. And what I really want to wait for is to see if they're going to bring the stylus down to the non-Pro, like the full-size iPad size, because my iPad is sitting on the nightstand next to my bed. I use it all the time, although a little bit less so now that my iPad 3 is getting a little bit slow with modern software on it. iPad Pro, I like the idea of it. I do like the stylus, but I'm not sure the size is exactly right for me. As I've talked about in ATP, I can envision a much larger iPad Pro as it starts to get more and more into just like a desktop replacement iPad, which sounds crazy to people, but give it time, it might not be so crazy. Right now, we're just kind of trying to get into laptop replacement iPads, but I'm thinking farther ahead than that. But I really do like the full size iPad form factor, but I also like the stylus. So I didn't want to replace my iPad 3 with an iPad Air, and I wasn't quite ready to jump into the Pro. So I'm just kind of in a wait and see period now, and I will replace my iPad. Probably with just a plain old full-size one, but maybe with a Pro. I don't know. The Pro definitely does have appeal. Like, I'm basically restraining myself from, also because it's a first-generation device, so I'm good at waiting. So next year, we'll see what happens on the iPad front for me.
How about this? And I was thinking about it as I was putting this question together, and I think actually you did, so I apologize for any redundancy. Jason Snell over at Six Colors did this wonderful kind of 2015 report card on Apple a week or two ago that I thought was really interesting in terms of kind of putting grades to all the different aspects of Apple in 2015. Just overall, it seemed like a big collection of kind of home runs and swings and misses in 2015, if that's a fair summary. Overall, if you had to give it a letter grade on the 2015 performance for Apple, what would you give it?
I actually did this on my blog a while back. I think I did like a 2013 or 2014 to-do list, and at the end of the year, I went through the to-do list and gave letter grades. It's very difficult to sum them all up because you lose a lot of the nuances. Like when Jason broke it down, that was much better because you could see on the graph,
right.
Like, oh, they did, everyone loves the hardware. Like thumbs up, it's really nice. It's good looking, it has nice features, it's sturdy, it's reliable, the hardware is great. And then you look down at like, server side cloud services, right. And they have a terrible grade. So you average it all out and it comes into like a B-. Like, what does that even tell you? It doesn't tell you that their hardware is stellar. It doesn't tell you that they're really suffering in cloud services. It just tells you, it makes you think they just did meh, when really it's more of kind of a spiky type thing. So for 2015, I'd give them like a B or B-, something like that, because they really did have a lot of highs, but there was a lot of shakiness mixed in there. So I think the truth is not adequately conveyed by a single letter grade, but if I had to give it, it would probably be B-ish.
It's funny. I was on hypercritical.co, and folks, as always, all these links are in the show notes, and I went back and I found it. You were right, Apple's 2013 scorecard. And what's interesting is I was just scanning this while you were talking. I just want to read back one bullet to you. It Third bullet, keep the iPad on track. This was written, you wrote this January 2nd, 2014. The iPad Air is impressive, and the Mini finally went Retina. On the downside, the creaky old iPad 2 lives on, and the iPad Air really deserves more RAM, and a larger iPad Pro is still off in the hazy future. The iPad is on track for sure, but exciting times are still ahead, A-.
Yeah, I've been on the iPad Pro bandwagon for a while. I had a hypercritical episode around episode 58 or something, where I just went on this whole thing about the iPad Pro of like, I feel like there should be a bigger iPad. Let's call it an iPad Pro that you could fit more stuff on the screen for, and I've argued for this many times. I mean, obviously, Apple eventually made it, and they happened to give it the same name as I came up with. It doesn't take too much insight to see, like, just extrapolate from current trends and realize things like, that computers are going to get faster, there's going to be more RAM, a stylus is inevitable for iOS devices, and the iPad's going to get bigger, and there'll be a Pro version, right? Like, and so I take no particular credit for the predictive powers, but to be able to like look at trends and extrapolate, it takes a little bit of a quality that a lot of real big tech heads don't have a lot of, which is realizing that things are the way they are not because of any sort of intrinsic nature or natural way of things, but just because a series of events that led up to it. So like that there's no way that a tablet can ever replace a laptop because reasons X, Y, Z, from people who have used laptops all their lives, right? You really have to have more perspective and realize why are smartphones so popular? What is it that makes them so popular? How do those apply to tablets as well? Why do people fail to do things successfully with what we think of as traditional PCs and laptops? Why do people find iPads easier? And just extrapolating for that and saying, iPad and the smartphone are the future of computing and the PC is the past. And so it seems clear that there's going to inevitably be a bigger iPad because people are more comfortable with tablets than they are with PCs, but tablets are much less capable. So inevitably, tablets will become more capable to let more people be able to do more things and so on and so forth. You could have done exactly the same thing back before the dawning of the Mac and realized more people can use GUIs. And even though every personal computer we have now has a command prompt in it, GUIs are easier for people, and they may seem less capable, and people may sneer at them, but it's clearly the future of computing, so I can predict that eventually there'll be some kind of graphical user interface on personal computers. And then the first one comes out, it's not that good, not that popular, and, but eventually it happens. So this type of, if you've been in this game long enough, it's easy to see the broad trends, and then, you can't nail down like, what year are they going to make the iPad Pro? What are they going to call it? Or will it be a Pro? Or for all you know, Apple will go out of business and someone else will make that computer. But broadly speaking, it's easy to make those calls, I feel like.
Well, if the iPad continues to evolve and it becomes a more and more powerhouse, I imagine Marco may consider it as long as they come up with a better keyboard. Because that's the thing.
Keyboards. That's what old people use. Who knows what they'll come up with next? Who knows? Maybe people tapping on an invisible keyboard with a VR helmet or something ridiculous. You just got to keep an open mind to this stuff, and look at what actual people do. Like smartphones prove that actual people take to tapping their fingers on a piece of glass way more easily than they take to even clicking menus in Windows. And they took to menus in Windows more easily than they took to typing things at an empty command prompt.
So 2015 for Apple had a bunch of different storylines, right? Be it Apple Music, the Watch, iPad Pro, so on and so forth. What do you think either will be or should be the big storylines in 2016?
I don't think anything. I mean, so you got the car lurking out there in the distance, right? The Apple car.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's happening in 2016, but it's lurking out there. I'm trying to think if there's anything big coming between now and the car, and probably it's just extrapolations of the things they're already doing. Well, the television service, they really need to make deals with all the content providers to provide a compelling alternative to cable. So far, they haven't managed to do that, but it's an obvious thing they can do. Evolutions of all existing hardware platforms, like introducing the watch, making the watch, evolving the watch, newer versions of the watch, better versions, figuring out what that thing is good for. The iPad Pro is their very first take on trying to push iOS devices further into the laptop realm. All that stuff needs to evolve. And if you look at Jason Snell's report card for Apple this year, or talk to any people, Apple nerds, they will all tell you that there are lots of areas that Apple could do better in terms of reliability and, for their software, bugs, cloud services, stuff like that. Understandable user interface, interaction between cloud services and applications, and data management, all those things that we've been perennially complaining about for Apple. they could get better with. So 2016 seems like a year where they should be iterating on things that they introduced in 2015 or product lines that they've had for a while and that are evolving. It's easy to say, they just make everything you already have better. That's kind of a boring year. But you need to have those boring years punctuated by, guess what? We've got a watch. And guess what? We're, finally progressing the iPad line to a larger area. As with Apple, there could always be surprises. Who knows what they've got in the works? Obviously, VR is also lurking out there. Right. Surely Apple is doing something involving that, but so far we don't even have a glimmer of any ideas, and it's an Apple thing to do to wait and see. So I would expect I hope 2016 is fairly boring in terms of big, bold product announcements, but I hope every Apple product that they make gets better substantially without radically changing in any particular way.
One of the tech products of the last year that has been talked about a lot, and I don't have, which is strange because I'm very much like a lot of you guys. I spend way too much money buying a lot of way too many things, especially Apple stuff, that was actually really well reviewed and still continued to talk about. Jason is one who talks about it. Do you think Apple will do, or would you be interested in, if they did so, their Siri version spin on like the Amazon Echo?
That definitely seems like something that the old Apple, John Scully era Apple maybe would do, because it's like, well, we have the technology and we could do something like that. Let's just throw it out there and see if it sticks. And although Apple has become more open to new product ideas, it's not that open. That's definitely an Amazon way to go. Like, I know people who enjoy their record. It doesn't play to Apple's strengths either, because Apple's got Siri, and that's interesting. But they've never been really good at the big data side of it. They're not running a gigantic retail store like Amazon where they can connect all these things up to the potential purchases. And they're not like organizing the world's information like Google, where you could ask questions that, at this point, Google could basically translate your speech directly into text and put it into Google search box and have half of the product, because Google search is so smart about, context and what it does and stuff like that. And so I think what Apple would say is, we don't need the Amazon Echo. We already have it. It's called your iPhone. It's with you all the time, and you don't have to shout into the air. You can just say, hey, Siri, and say the same thing, and we hope we do a good job. But I just think that Apple is still behind both Amazon and Google in the smarts behind that type of service. And I really don't think Apple would sell you a dedicated cylinder to do that, because they already sell you so many things that can already do that.
Yeah, I've heard it tossed out there in terms of if they would do it, and I agree with you. I don't know that it would ultimately be the product that maybe Amazon has put out there. And my thought was it could be a good Apple Music push, right? And Apple Music tends to need all the help that it can get right now, and which and I just signed up, re-signed up after the free trial for my daughter at Christmas time, got her the Apple Music subscription, so I'm back on the hook for it. But it just would be interesting to see if maybe that would help bolster it, have a hardware component to it in addition to all the phones and iPods.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're creeping up on it, like software wise. Like, everybody seems to have some kind of branded thing that they conceptualize as like a thing, whether it's Cortana or Siri or Amazon Echo or whatever. Like, you talk and this thing answers your question, sort of an artificially intelligent agent kind of thing, only the world's most primitive version of it. And it's just a question of what is listening to me and what server backend is providing the answer. And so Siri is that, and Siri's built into Apple TV, and it's it's a marketing term. Siri, what is Siri, right? It's whatever we tell you it is, that when you talk, it gives you an answer, right? Right. Could they build the same service into Apple's airport hubs? I mean, it's already in your phones and your television, in other hardware they sell you. Like, there's no reason they couldn't do that. But I think what Apple should be concentrating on is not worrying so much about the hardware interface to that, but worrying about what takes those words and provides an answer, because that is definitely the hard part, and that is the part where they're farthest behind. At any point, they can try to put the hardware down for that. Now, if they wanted to go Apple Music and try to compete against Sonos to say, buy a bunch of these little Apple doodads and you can fill your house with music and it's integrated with Apple Music, maybe, but you got the ghost of the iPod Hi-Fi lurking out there telling them that maybe that's not a business they want to be in either.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, there's all kinds of different topics I could bring up for you, John, but I do want to be respectful of your time. So all the links to the show notes, all the links will be in the show notes, folks, for all the various shows and different endeavors that John has out there. But is there one thing before I let you go that maybe you could share with us that might be a little behind-the-scenes nugget of some of these shows that I know a lot of people have been listening to for a long time, and maybe something they haven't heard before, maybe an insulting Casey story or something like that?
I guess maybe the only aspect that I think people might not, maybe they know about it, is they hear us talk about it in some of the shows, but I talk about Apple on a lot of my podcasts, right? And surprisingly, in almost all of my podcasts, I've organized what we call the show notes, which is confusing because podcasts, when you publish them, have a show notes, which is something that the listeners can go to, usually on the website for the podcast, and see links to the things discussed in the show. But on ATP, we also call the document that the three hosts work from to do the show, that sort of has bullet points for our topics, we also call those the show notes, which doesn't make any sense. But anyway, for all of my shows, I've had the host side show notes in Google Docs. Even though none of my shows are about Google, and, you know, some might say that sometimes we are slightly antagonistic towards Google. I don't think I am. I really love Google. But anyway, yeah, Google powers all of my podcasts. ATP, Reconcilable Differences, even Robot or Not, because of the collaborative editing, because Google Docs is always online. It's always there. You know, we all have Google accounts, even those of us who may not like Google that much, Marco. And we interactively edit these notes during the show sometimes, even like in real time, all of us together. Like before the show, we have it all organized. We have different sections for what's going to be pre and post show. As people mention things, we look up the links and type them in. We put bullet points into the show notes right up until the moment of the show, and then even during the show. So Google, unknowingly and perhaps surprisingly, is powering and has powered all of my podcasting endeavors.
I'm sure they'll be happy to hear that. And last week's guest here on the podcast, Jess Russell Ivanovich, co-host of Material, is probably also happy to hear that as well. So, John, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. This has been great. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
And folks, make sure you go check out the show notes you can access by swiping over or tapping on your podcast player of choice to find out where you can follow John on Twitter or hypercritical.co. Any of his great shows will all be in there. Folks, that'll do it for this week of the Podcast Digest. Thank you for listening. Until next week, my name's Dan Lizette, and I will talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.